I'm Jim Searing, president of the Pennsylvania and New Jersey chapter of the American Chestnut Foundation. Our webcasts are here to update you on the quest to save the American chestnut and restore it to our homes, our farms, our fields, and our forests. We're glad you joined us. Let's get right into our program. The American Chestnut Foundation, or TACF for short, was formed to save the tree and restore what was lost. Today, this program is one of the most ambitious ecological restoration programs in the world. Some American chestnut trees do remain in the wild, and they really are essential for the future of this species. Remember how rare American bison and bald eagles were only 3 decades ago? Ultimately, we need a comeback that would equal or exceed their return to the wild. Our guest today is a very active chapter board member, leading our efforts to find and catalog the American chestnuts that are surviving in the wilds of Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Lake was a state park officer for DCNR, working at the Lackawanna and Hickory State Parks in central PA. He's pursued a passion for trees and earned a master's in ecology from Penn State. Lake has worked closely with 2 legends of Pennsylvania, Dr. Kim Steiner at Penn State and with Dr. Blair Carbaugh at his research orchards. Lake, welcome to Chestnut Week.
Thanks, Jim. That was a very nice introduction. So for all you here today, I'd like to keep my presentation practical. We're going to be talking about how to locate American chestnuts. First of all, to do that, you have to know, well, what the American chestnut is. That'll help those of you who don't know too much about the species. We'll talk about how to identify the tree. And then we'll talk about where to actually find these things. And I'm just going to jump right into it. So, the American chestnut. What is it? Well, it's like Jim said, it's a tree native to North America. Now here in this screen, you can see the size that these trees used to get to. Photo on your left shows an old growth chestnut forest in a good site. And these trees grew all the way up and down the East Coast of the United States, up into the, all the way from Mississippi up to Maine. The map on the right shows our estimate of what the natural range was at about 1910. So why do we care about American chestnuts? Well, as you can maybe tell from the picture on the left, they're a good source, or they could be a good source of timber. The chestnut tree can compete with other trees growing in the United States, and in the right conditions, it can grow straight and tall, and it's useful for a lot of things. A lot of the barns in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, where I live, were actually built out of chestnut beams because they're widely available and they're rot resistant, which is a good quality for chestnut that also makes it good to use as fence posts and sidings for buildings and anything you want to have outside a structure like that for a while. Also, they make good fuel. If you're someone who believes in carbon neutral heating, burning wood is one of the ways you can help reduce your carbon footprint. And of course, my favorite part about chestnuts is the actual chestnuts themselves, the food. The tree and the nut that it produces are synonymous. And the picture in the center shows you a picture of just what chestnuts look like. The actual nut is that little brown thing, and the spiky ball is what the tree encases it in while the nut's being produced. They taste kind of like chicken, chicken and mashed potatoes. Once they're roasted. And people in the United States have been gathering chestnuts ever since they were around. And Native Americans most certainly did. And the picture on the right just shows an author's depiction from 1878 about gathering chestnuts, which was a yearly activity that people did. It helped support a lot of the local economies in Appalachia too. But for ecological reasons, I should mention the chestnut's also important to restore for the native ecosystem, because a lot of insects, even, but things that people care about, like megafauna such as deer and bear also can find good sources of food in chestnuts. So what happened to it? Well, today American chestnut has been mostly killed off by the blight. Um, this These are pictures in the left and in the center of what the USDA Forest Service was encountering in the early 1900s. You can see that in the 1950s, which is where the map in the center was taken from a publication. They believe it started in New York City and spread out to the Southwest. And you can see by 1940, throughout most of its range, chestnut had been pretty much taken out by the blight. Now we think that maybe the blight started in a couple different areas throughout the United States because the blight came over on imported Chinese and Japanese chestnuts that evolved along with the blight fungus, which is what causes the disease on American chestnuts. And they were resistant to it because they evolved with it, but the chestnut hadn't seen this type of fungus for a while, and it just had no resistance to it. And so what happened is fungus came along, and in the picture on the right, you can see what happens is this is a blight infested stem of a chestnut. The blight goes underneath the bark and kills the tree around the stem and stops the tree's flow of nutrients from coming from the roots to the top of the stem of the tree. And that's what kills the top of the tree. However, fortunately, it doesn't destroy the roots. And that is how we're able to find chestnuts today, because they keep resprouting from those old root systems that can be over 100 years old. So how can we identify American chestnuts in the field? Well, American chestnuts are deciduous trees, which means that they lose their leaves in the fall. So right now, when I'm talking to you, it's January. But if you're watching this earlier and it's the springtime or summertime, you'll be able to find the leaves of the chestnut. And they are canoe-shaped leaves. They're about 6 to 9 inches long. You can see them. I laid a couple of them on a piece of notebook paper here on the left, and a piece of the twig. And the leaf to the left is the underside of the leaf, and to the right, the upper side of the leaf. Like most leaves, underside's a little bit lighter than the upper side. They're very thin, paper thin leaves. And the most distinctive thing about the leaf is the leaf teeth. Castania dentata, which is the Latin name for chestnut. Dentata means toothed or teeth. And so if you look closely at the edges of the leaf here in this second photo, you can see that the leaves have this very characteristic hook shape, or what I like to think of as ocean waves breaking on the beach kind of shape. And that is very unique to American chestnuts. Now, American chestnuts, when you find them growing, the leaves growing together in a tree, they're going to be alternate, which means that as you come up the twig that the leaves are attached to, you'll have one leaf, but you won't have a leaf coming off the opposite side. That's an opposite leaf tree. Instead, you have a little bit of space, and then on the other side, after you come up a little bit, then you have another leaf. So that's alternately arranged. And also in this picture, you can see that the twigs themselves tend to be brownish, grayish in color, very slender. And when they're young, they can be green like this. This is the current season's year of growth in this one shoot, and you can see the very tip is still green, but as they get older, they do get brown and hardened off. But probably one of the most interesting things about chestnuts are the catkins. So these are the male flowers of the tree, and they actually appear in June, which is kind of rare for trees, at least in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Most trees flower earlier in the year, right when the leaves are coming out. But this will happen when the leaves are already out. They're kind of like little white fuzzy twigs. And they also have a very strong aroma. These can be found, like I said, in June. And these are really characteristic of chestnut trees. Other trees do produce catkins, but only chestnuts produce catkins that are this showy. And at least in North America, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, where I'm familiar with. The thing about catkins is actually that's how I found one tree in my neighborhood. Actually, this is just off the side of a sidewalk in a suburban neighborhood, and I was walking along and I found these little fuzzy guys on the ground. And these I knew were catkins. Here's a picture of them a couple weeks after they've matured and fallen off the tree. And these will actually stay good up through autumn. They'll turn brown, but you can still find them. And actually, one of the ways I find chestnuts is just walking around, looking at the ground because I don't want to trip. And then I see a couple of these catkins, and then I start looking up. And finally, of course, the fun things, the burrs and the nuts. Okay, so the burr is the spiky ball that houses the nut while it's growing, and that stops animals from eating it because the nuts themselves actually aren't bitter at all. They don't really have any tannins in them. So if they weren't protected, animals could just eat them before they were mature and they wouldn't be spread. The nuts are pretty small. And the right is pictured in my hand, and you can see the American chestnut compared to your Chinese chestnut. So the chestnuts you might find in a grocery store, they're bigger than most people's thumbs, and those are the ones that you find in the grocery store because those are the ones that we're still able to grow. American chestnuts are pretty small, about a half an inch or 1 centimeter in width. And the shape, I think that looks kind of like a Hershey's Kiss. And here's a picture in the center of a young tree that's actually producing a burr. So when they're green, when they're young and developing, the burrs are like bright green, they look like little fuzzy clouds growing right off the stem of the tree. And this is a picture of a very large chestnut that has resprouted, and the stem has grown out over a road. Now you can see hundreds of burrs on this tree, hopefully. Now, even though I did find hundreds of burrs on this one tree, I only was able to recover 7 to 9 viable nuts because one of the reasons finding nuts is so rare is because trees require different individuals to reproduce. The mother tree has to have pollen from a different chestnut tree in order to produce nuts. A lot of times what you'll find is if there's a chestnut tree that's isolated, at usually even distances of more than a mile or more than 500 feet or so, if chestnuts are spaced out farther than that, they can have poor pollination. And so it's not getting pollen from another tree. It can't produce viable nuts. It'll produce these burrs, but the nuts inside them will be flat and paper-like. So don't be discouraged, though. If you find a tree that's doing this, it's very rare and important. Finally, the bark. This is probably the hardest way to identify trees, but it's good to know just in case you're looking for something else. So on the left, you see this is the picture of a young chestnut tree. And so when it's young, the bark is rather smooth. You can see it's starting to furrow there. Now, when it gets old, as a picture in the center, it tends to get deeply furrowed. And I would say the furrows kind of are going up the tree in a slanty way and connected and not rounded, but tipped, coming to a triangle-like point. Finally, probably the easiest way, though, to identify American chestnut is chestnuts with the blight. So if you look at the picture on the right, see this is a young chestnut, so it has a smooth bark, but you can see the blight affecting the tree. And that's these orange little pustules coming out of the bark. Those are actually the fungus's fruiting bodies. And then you can see that the bark is kind of sunken and a little purplish. That's the chestnut blight. So this is going to go around the tree and kill it. But if you do find that, that means that you found an American chestnut. Okay. And so finally, we talked about how to identify chestnuts by squinting at them really close. But as you get better, you'll start being able to identify these trees from quite a ways away. One of the most common forms that chestnuts take, because they are constantly resprouting from the same root system, is a cluster of sprouts that foresters like to call stump sprouts. Here on the left, you can see a picture of a stump sprout growing in a recently cut down forest that it reemerged from. A lot of the stems are already dead. Some of the bark is flaking off the sides. Here in the center, there's a chestnut that has resprouted after the main stem has died. It's shooting out a lot of small, mid-sized stems. And on the right, we look at another sprout stump cluster that's, the sprouts are a lot smaller and closer to the ground. So this is the way I find 90% of the chestnuts that I encounter in the wild. The other 10% can be mature single stems. Often you'll see blight scars. Picture on the left shows a tree with some blight scars. It's actually grown around them a little bit, with this, which is promising. In the center, I like to look straight up at trees, and I think that helps me. This is a picture of a chestnut tree looking straight up in the summer. And one of the really characteristic things about chestnuts is that because they keep getting knocked back from the blight, they tend to be growing in the understory. Fortunately, chestnuts have an intermediate shade tolerance, so they can't tolerate lots of shade. But in an oak forest such as this one, where you can see there's lots of spaces in the canopy, the tree can put on a really dense amount of leaves. And if you're walking through a forest and you see a tree growing in the understory that has a lot of leaves, that might be a sign that it's a chestnut. So go up and look at it. They tend to have a really straight central stem, straight, slender central stem, and the branches tend to come off of it at about 90-degree angles. It tend to be pretty slender as well, in my experience. And here's a picture. This tree was found by a forester in southern Pennsylvania. And this is an example of probably one of the best trees that you'll find out in the wild. You can see that chestnuts, well, this is an isolated chestnut. It's been there long enough that the bark's starting to get furrowed in the center. And you can see that the branches are starting to get big enough that they're starting to droop down a little bit on the sides. So if you find this, you're very lucky. Normally the stems don't get this large, but when they're isolated, this is an example of just how big they can get. So where do you find American chestnuts? Well, I alluded to this a little bit before, but you can look in oak forest openings. And openings can mean anything from roads to trails. Those are easily accessible, to rocky places, which are often found on the tops of the ridges, and recent timber harvest, because that's where the old overstory has been cleared and lots of light's available for the chestnuts. Because remember, they can't get up into the overstory anymore. Also, head for the hills. Chestnuts really prefer well-drained soil. And place names such as Sand Spring, Sandy Ridge, and Chestnut Ridge also are good clues as to where to look for chestnuts. Oak forests, why do you look there? Well, because oaks and chestnuts, they used to grow there together. And trees don't move. So the chestnuts that were alive before the blight, those are where the root systems still are, and those trees are still in the same areas because they haven't been able to create new trees. They're still sprouting up from those same stump sprouts, from those same root clusters. And openings, because trees can't get up to the canopy anymore. So they need at least a little bit of light to survive and make food for that root system to keep it going. This picture on the left is a chestnut oak, the leaf and the bark. It's called chestnut oak pot for a couple reasons. That's the common name. One reason is because the leaves kind of look like chestnuts, except you can see that they have rounded edges on the teeth where chestnut, the leaves are hooked, and the bark gets really, really thickly furrowed into rock-like plates. That's why the other name for this oak, another common name for the oak, is rock oak or stone oak. But if you find these chestnut oaks, you're in a spot where you might find American chestnuts. Also, there are online resources now. For example, the PADCNR has a map of recent timber harvest. You can access that online. Just do a Google search for PADCNR recent timber harvest and you'll find it. So here's an example of where I found some chestnuts, just kind of using place names. And sort of clues that I found where I was working. So the picture on the left is a trail that I was on, and you can see that the trail was really, really sandy. This is where I found a lot of chestnuts. So if you're on a trail with soil or sand like this, that's a good spot where you might find chestnuts. And the map on the right, so the red dots are where I did find chestnuts. And you can see in the lower left, Sand Spring Run and Chestnut Ridge in the upper right. Right in between those two place names on the topo map is where I found chestnuts along the road. As you can see, I didn't really venture out to the woods too much because there's a lot of rhododendron up there in the Poconos. But this is where you can find chestnuts. Here's another example. So Castania, it is an old city just to the east of Lock Haven, Pennsylvania. That's in central Pennsylvania in the Ridge and Valley region. And Castania, well, that's the Latin name for chestnuts. Interestingly, I was reading an article, which you can see the link to down there, that said, that confirmed, this place was called Castania because there were a lot of chestnuts there. Now, some of those were planted by the Italian immigrants, but probably some of them were native. And I thought, I'll go check out the hills, head to the hills around this place named Castania and see if I find any. And sure enough, right there on the ridge to the east, I found there were 4 locations where I found chestnuts. And from here, I did collect 9 to 10 chestnuts from a tree that was growing from a kind of a precarious position. If you are heading out to these rocky, ridgy areas, I would say be real careful and take a friend. Rattlesnakes sometimes like to live up here, so just be mindful of them. I'd never have a problem with them, but I'm always just aware of where they are, and I go slow. So now that concludes my educational part of the program for helping you know what chestnuts are, how to identify them, and where to find them. If you'd like to help us, we're really interested in finding these chestnuts because to restore the species, we need to try to make sure that we conserve as much of the genetic diversity of the species as possible. We can only do that by finding American chestnuts. And what we do is we take the chestnuts, we plant them in conservation orchards where we can look after them, tend them. There are things you can do to slow down the blight, and we can then breed them with resistant material, such as through back cross breeding the traditional way, and possibly through the transgene chestnut if it's approved. Of course, you don't have to do any of this, but this is just what we'd like you to do for the Chestnut Foundation if you're interested. How to send us samples. We want leaf and twig samples only, so don't send us nuts, don't send us burrs. Please press them between 2 pieces of cardboard or paperboard. That just helps the sample stay intact and gives us a good sample, helps it dry out. We like to have them dry, actually, so don't try to keep them alive. Your job is to kill it as quickly as possible and make it as flat as possible. And just send it in an envelope to either of these 2 addresses, 206 Forest Resources Lab. That is the main address for the PA New Jersey chapter. So the main scientist, Sarah, will take a look at it there. Or you can send it to me. That's my address down there. When you do send them, we have a tree locator form that I'll give you a link to at the end of the presentation. And that you could fill that out. It has different information areas, like we like to know the coordinates of the tree, if it's producing nuts or burrs, how tall it is, etc. At least give us your name and address or a way to contact you so we can get back to you. Here's a list of resources that I would recommend. Of course, my chapter of the American Chestnut Foundation, that's the office phone number and email. If you call that phone or use that email, someone in the office will forward your concern or question on to someone who can help you. Also, like I mentioned, the tree locator form is here at this address. It's on our website. This is our webpage. So go ahead and visit that. We got a lot of cool stuff on there. It takes a while to navigate through it, but this is not something that you're gonna spend 5 minutes on if you're interested in finding chestnuts. And I think that's part of the whole point. Also, if you're into smartphone apps, we recommend getting TreeSnap. It's an app that allows you to take pictures with your phone And if you want, you can upload it to the online database with the coordinates. Sarah, the regional science coordinator for our chapter, can actually then access that information. Now, if you do take tree snap um, things and we're interested in the tree, we will probably try to contact you to get a sample. It's up to you whether or not you want to do that, obviously. And finally, if you're interested in looking at more videos, I'd recommend this YouTube video down in the right corner of the screen. It goes really into depth about not only finding chestnuts, but why they're located where they are, and the specifics on really what we're looking for and why we're trying to find surviving American chestnuts. So that concludes my presentation. We did have some pre-screen questions from one of the people who wanted to attend this video. So the first question was, has Baldpate Mountain, New Jersey been explored for American chestnuts? And actually, yes. So this is Baldpate Mountain. It's a nature preserve on the border of New Jersey and Pennsylvania, sort of in central New Jersey. And there's actually two parts to it. I haven't been there, but I've just looked it up to try to answer the question. And just to the west of Strawberry Hill Manor, there's an old mansion here. One of our board members, actually, Mike Alcott, found a chestnut here, right along the edge of a trail. And this tree, at least it was alive in 2018, 40 feet tall and 8.5 inches in diameter. But it was isolated, so there were no burrs, and it wasn't yet producing any catkins. So we're going to keep an eye on that tree, but certainly if you're interested in exploring areas for chestnuts, this would be a good area for chestnuts. I can see there's a power line here, so that would provide an edge, and a lot of trails looks like can be accessed here, plus it's public property. So thank you. And I hope that you're having a good day, and good luck on your hunt for chestnuts.
Okay, so here's a couple of questions. First question is from Asanta. Do the catkins or leaves have a distinct smell?
Oh, yes. Thank you for mentioning that. I forgot to mention this, but yes, the catkins on chestnuts have a distinct bleach-like smell, a pungent or musty aroma. It's harder to describe than that. It's just a sort of a bleach, kind of a bleach-like smell. And once you kind of connect the smell with the actual tree, you'll be able to remember that every time, because smell is one of the best ways to remember plants, actually. So good question. That's an important thing to mention.
It's a good question. And I just want to share my experience. I one time cut a series of branches off of a Chinese chestnut and brought it into my house to take a look at it. And the whole upstairs of my house was a disaster. I really had to get it out of my house because it's really powerful. So it's amazingly powerful. So another question, what is a horse chestnut?
So a horse chestnut belongs to a different species, a different genus, a tree. There is a native species called the Ohio buckeye. I believe it's in the same genus as a horse chestnut. It is not, horse chestnut is just a common name. It's not edible. I think it might actually even be poisonous. Don't eat them. A good way to tell them apart is a horse chestnut. The leaf is palmate. So the one stalk that comes out from the twig, there'll be 5 or more leaflets that come out sort of in a palm shape from that central, what they call a petiole, the thing that attaches the leaf to the actual woody twig. And that's kind of your dead giveaway that it's a horse chestnut. They produce nuts that look like chestnuts. That's why people call them horse chestnuts, but they're not chestnuts. They're not true chestnuts.
Okay, thank you. Steve asked the question, have you or anyone found an increase in stump sprouts of chestnut trees since the deer population in PA has been reduced?
I'm not old enough I got interested in chestnuts maybe 10 years ago, maybe less. Before that, I wasn't too aware of them. I know that deer love to browse chestnuts at my dad's place, so we're trying to grow chestnuts. Um, we've had multiple times where even after we've had them in a cage, the deer just come right up to the edge of the cage and go in as far as they can. So probably would be my answer, but I don't have any actual information for you.
Okay. Another question from Steve. Here in Schuylkill County, chestnut oaks have been dying in large numbers. I've noticed these dead oak canopies have released many understory American chestnuts. Has this been happening in other places?
Yeah, Steve. I'm guessing Steve Delp. Hi. Yeah, we talked a little bit before about chestnuts and stuff, but yeah, I've noticed that too. And actually, my grandfather owns a patch of forest land up on Catawissa Mountain that was hit by gypsy moth multiple years in a row, and that's killing a lot of chestnut oak trees across the state. And where it does, if there's chestnut sprouts or root systems under a story, we do see them sort of having a breath of fresh air and putting on new growth. I've seen it anywhere there's been oak dieback from gypsy moth. So yeah, that's also a really good place to look for chestnuts. One of the things I'd be interested to know is if when we restore the American chestnut, how vulnerable they're going to be to gypsy moth. Is it going to be as vulnerable to gypsy moth as oak or not? And that's something that interests me. But yeah, I've seen that elsewhere along the state, especially where there have been gypsy moth outbreaks.
Okay, well done. Lori asks a question and I'm going to choose to answer it. So she said, I missed the presentations earlier this week. Can I get links to these sessions? And she's also said she'd like help in locating trees in Chester County. The first part of that question is yes, Lori and everyone. We are basically putting on our website each day's presentation we're working on, and I think 4 of them are now live on our website, and all of them will be there. Thank you for asking that question. Regarding, is there a way we could help someone looking for chestnuts in Chestnut County?
Maybe. Why not look at the Google Maps? Somebody else can ask a question while this is loading too, and I'll see if I can find any places could recommend for her to go.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question. Will Asian chestnut hybridize readily with American chestnut in the field? And if so, can you tell if you're looking at a hybrid? What if the nuts you collect from an American chestnut were pollinated by an Asian chestnut?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So if you're finding trees, so first of all, yes, they do, and they do it quite frequently. And it actually, Sandra from the USDA Forest Service, who's been working at the Connecticut Experimentation Center or Forest Experiment Center, has said that for hundreds of years, chestnuts have been hybridizing in the wild, and she finds a lot of hybrids. I have found that most of the trees that I find that are just growing from this, when they're growing from the stump sprouts, it's pretty obvious they're American. Yeah, as far as though if they're pollinated, typically if it's in an area that's like down around civilization, that's where the Chinese chestnuts were planted and the Japanese chestnuts were planted. So the chances of it become more likely as you get farther down the slope into the valleys where people live. As far as finding out whether something's a hybrid tree, usually the traits are intermediate and you can't tell. That's why you could use us, send us a sample, a leaf and twig sample, and we can look at it through the microscope. There's different microscopic characteristics you can see on the other side of the leaf that can give you more information about whether or not it's a pure American Asian or if it's a hybrid. Okay, I did find this place in Chester County. So up in the northwest, it looks like there's a ridge area near French Creek State Park. I would look up here. French Creek State Park is is a nice public area. You can go look. Oh, and look, there's this Natural Lands Crow's Nest Preserve. That's in a nice ridgy area, a nice forested area that I think chestnuts, and there's a state game lands up here. So yeah, go up to French Creek State Park or the St. Peter's Morgantown area, and look up there if you're in Chester County. I'd say it's a good place, but it looks like there's lots of little old pockets of forest in the Piedmont here that might be worth exploring. So,
Okay, thank you. Nell asks, is there a comparable organization in West Virginia? I'm located in the mid-Ohio Valley. 35 years ago, there were still dead chestnuts lying on the ground behind my home.
Yeah, don't we have a, Jim, don't we have a West Virginia chapter of the American Chestnut Foundation?
Yes, that's a great question. There are, I believe, 16 chapters, and West Virginia has its own. And you can go to the American Chestnut Foundation website and connect to and look up West Virginia. And now I think you'll find a very active chapter. They actually have an annual festival of chestnuts in your state, and it's very well revered. The website for TACF is www.acf.org.